Hi Guy, welcome to episode 14 of the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and this week we'll be taking a look at Pushover. But before we do, let's just jump into some news. First thing I wanted to mention is, and I'm really grateful, I've had two people come forward on the Patreon account and offer some support. Erland Dal Sakeshag, I'm really sorry Erland if I got your name wrong, and then Adam Bradley. Again, and I don't expect anything for doing the podcast, but you know, it does have its expenses and I'm quite happy to pay for this myself, but you know, it's really fantastic that people are willing to come forward and offer something and, you know, just contribute in general. And another Patreon supporter, O'Brien's Vintage Retro, sent me a copy of Amiga Future, issue 130, and they're currently celebrating 20 years. Like I say, I vaguely knew about this sort of existing, but I'd never read it in person before. And you know, they do an English one, and I think it's German is the other side. I can't read German, I'm afraid, so you've no chance of me telling you what that one's like. But it's actually quite good. It's really good quality printing. It's a very glossy magazine, and I mean, I'm just flicking through the issue now. 50 pages, which again isn't bad. It's big A4 issue. Full staple. Again, that's good quality. That's better. Because I mean, I've got some old Amiga mags sat around, and this is much better quality than what you used to get back into the day. I think it sells for around about £10 on various Amiga places, and I think Amiga Kit does it. But a big thank you to O'Brien. I've never read this before. It has some pretty interesting articles in. There's some game reviews in there. Lots like recommendations of apps and programs to use. Is apps even the right name for the Amiga? I'm not entirely sure. But Aeon Technology, which is something about celebrating enhancer software for the newer Amigas. So it's pretty much got something for everyone in the world of Amiga. Now, some other website launched this week. Basically, Amiga International has been launched by one of the original people behind it is Stuart Williams. You can see that over on AmigaUserInternational.com, and you've got a bit of a blurb on the website. I thought it'd be easier to read it out. But AUI is an online magazine and tribute website dedicated to the original first ever European mag, which focused on the Commodore Amiga home computer. AUI was first published in a supplement in Commodore Computing International from 1986. In January 1988, it was relaunched as a full independent newsstand magazine, published by Croftward Limited. The launch of this website in January 2018 marks the 30th anniversary of that independence. Now, there's not much content on there at the moment. He's just been like doing the basic setup, but there's a few articles. But one of the biggest pieces on there is the reprint of an original AUI interview with Jay Miner, which is, you know, father of the Amiga. And it's actually quite a big and lengthy piece, and it's well worth a read. Again, you can find that at AmigaUserInternational.com. Now, there was a bit of sad news this week. I'm sure everybody's aware of his, if not directly of the person, who've certainly seen his art, but Bob Wakelin passed away last weekend. I mean, just going back in the day, some of the things that stick out in my mind are like covers like Epic. I mean, just for the Amiga, you know, some games like Midnight Resistance, WizKid, New Zealand Story. I mean, I've got that on a framed picture on a wall in the other room. It's absolutely fantastic. I actually believe it's one of his most hated piece of artwork from some stuff I'd read and him chatting online and stuff, which is a bit sad. But just as an example, I thought I went and found a website online which has got a full list of like all of his artwork and comments and interviews of stuff he said about it over the years. I will post that into the show notes, so there'll be a link on AmigaRama.com. But very, very sad news. I mean, he was always around like the retro stuff and the retro events. I mean, I'd seen him at a couple of places and even chatted a few times over the years going back on Facebook. So very, very sad news. Now, about a month ago, I was having huge problems with my Amiga 1200. Basically, the joystick stopped working and various parts wouldn't load correctly. I had huge issues with the compact flash hard drive and stuff. all sorts of terrible problems. And I started chatting to a guy on eBay who was like doing a recap service and then a semi-repair service and different things. But he basically offered service where you could send a board off to him and then he would, we'll recap it for you or do some work. And after talking to him, he wasn't 100% sure he'd be able to do anything with it, but instead he offered to send me a freshly recapped motherboard. Now, this arrived this week to my joy is all I can say, because I've been waiting for this for so long. He had a few problems over the past month. I think one of the IDE connectors was broken on the board, but he replaced that entirely off his own back, and it come through and had a very, very close look at it. I mean, I know nothing about soldering, but from what I could see of the motherboard and looking underneath and stuff, it looks pretty good. It's not like mis-soldered or big blobs everywhere, an absolute mess or anything like that. It's very, very clean, very, very good work. And of course, they're all fresh caps, so probably modern caps these days just last for years and years and years. And that's Retro Heaven 87 on eBay. I think he's doing recaps for about $39.99 or about $34.99. He's got different services in there, but I would highly recommend if you've got like an Amiga 1200, I think he does the other ones as well. I should have checked that sometime. I'm sorry. But it's well worth getting it done, because the thing with these electronics is, it's 30 years now since they were created and put into use, so they don't last. The problem is once they blow or they go out, then it can damage your motherboard and stuff, which put you in an even worse situation. But I've been chuffed to bits because I finally got my Amiga back working. I spent literally 3 hours putting it all back together, and it was quite ridiculous really, because as I was putting the motherboard back into like the metal shielding that it sits in on the lower part of the case, I suddenly realised I didn't have anything that would be able to get the little tiny, they look like screws, but like little nuts at the same time. I've never seen anything like this. I've got loads and loads of like screwdrivers and things to take stuff off, but I've got nothing that would even come close to taking that. So I had to sit there with this overly large set of pliers and for 3 hours just pry it bit by bit, because I couldn't take the full thing on because it would have like broken the plastic connects at the side. So I had to be very, very oh god, it was so tedious, and I was so relieved when it was finally done. I spent an entire night putting that back together. I was so exhausted that I couldn't even be bothered to play any games. But all I've been doing for like several nights this week is just like running through some games I've been itching to play for absolutely ages. Now I'm in a situation where I'm thinking, well, it really does need upgrading a bit more, and I'm starting to look at like accelerator cards and stuff like that. And I'm going down the usual route. Well, I've got an 8 meg expansion board inside, but I'm starting to think maybe I should be looking for something much better, like a 030, or I think it's 030, or 040 processor. And they tend to go for about £200 to £250, so I'm certainly in no rush to pay for one of them. But I'm really looking forward to expanding that Amiga. In particular, I've been looking at its OS 3.9. I'm using Classic Workbench at the moment. It's a bit clunky, the setup I've got, because I had issues when I was setting it up, so I could probably do with a refresh, but again, it's just time consuming. But I'm thinking you can buy these like compact flash cards on eBay, usually about £25-30, like 8 gigs, and everything's preloaded and I wouldn't have to do anything. And because I've got a nice slot now in the back panel of my Amiga 1200, I could just pop another flash card in without even having to open the system up anymore. So yeah, I think I'm going to do that at some point. It's time to move on to this week's game, which is Pushover. Now, this was published by Ocean. The developer was a company called Red Rat, who worked on it for over 18 months before releasing. That does seem quite a long time for an Amiga game. It came out in 1992 on just 2 floppy disks. It was priced at £25.99, pretty average at the time for a new release on the Amiga. Now, usually when I pick an Amiga game, I end up going through all sorts of different ones and seeing what might be interesting and what sort of history they've got behind it. But the reason I've gone for this one in particular is I was listening to the Amigos podcast a couple of weeks ago, and they were aiming to cover this, I think, because they're in the US, they didn't really understand that what Quavers was, because it's not a thing over there outside of the UK. And people were recommending, I think they were recommending like the Quavers game, and they ended up picking the sequel to this one, which is One Step Beyond, which is I think it's a rather ropey platform. I don't think they were too impressed by it. But, looking at the game off the back of that episode, and then I started vaguely remembering that this was actually a packing title. At the time it came with the A600, and I think it was called the Wild, the Weird and the Wicked pack. I think that's a bit like The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. It's sort of that joke, but reading about it, I mean, it included Pushover, a game called Grand Prix, Putty, that's quite a good one, and Deluxe Paint Free with a few workbench discs as well. Then again, they always did come with that. I mean, this was the Amiga I almost ended up getting as a kid. It was the one my parents pre-ordered at one shop, and then the shop phoned my poor old mother on the 24th of December, I believe, to tell her that, we can't supply, even though you paid for it in full, we just cannot supply. I'm really sorry. And of course they were absolutely really annoyed because it's the day before Christmas. This was my big present. They've not really bought me much else, and it was, I was all pumped up for it and stuff. And then they went on a mad dash to try and find another Amiga somewhere, and just by chance they found the A600 HD. I think I mentioned in the introduction episode, and that just went off down a different path. But they were more expensive than this standard pack at the time, so good on them for taking the extra effort and going getting that and stuff. But anyway, the artwork on the front of the box for this character and stuff, and this game in general, it's all based around Quavers and a character called Colin Curley, who was voiced by, I think it was, I'm not 100% sure about this because I couldn't really find confirmation, and most of it I was trying to work this out from listening to the adverts, but it sounded like Lenny Henry to me. I'm not 100% sure. I don't know anybody else who could give out in public that sort of a voice. And maybe I should have maybe looked on IMDb because they usually list stuff like that. I'm not sure if it's the same for the adverts, but the character itself, it's a very odd one. It's sort of like Warner Brothers style and Tex Avery, that classic sort of cartoon look from like the 50s and 60s, maybe a bit older. It's very, very odd character. Now, if you've not seen it, it's a dog in a yellow coat that whenever he takes Quavers starts turning into one and starts curling up and going crazy. And I don't, what was it about the mascot theme at the time that's driving people crazy? It was very, very, very odd. Now looking at the coders, I've got it written down as Dave and Helen Elcock. I'm hoping they're married. Also, Keith Waterson, and all three of them, I believe, worked on a game called Wild Wheels, and then another one called International Soccer Challenge. I'm pretty sure I've covered these coders before. My memory's not what it used to be. It was a multi-platform release for the ST, the SNES, and the PC. I'm actually surprised that didn't come out on a fair few other systems, because this would have been ideal for like maybe a handheld or just even some of the consoles and stuff. Apparently the game actually came with a free voucher for a packet of Quavers, or 23p off. I think it was a multi-pack. Oh god. I wonder how much Chris used the cost back in the day. They must have been about 35, 40p, so a bit of a bargain getting a free voucher out of it. The game itself, you'll probably understand when I start talking about it later, but looking into the history, the pushover part with the ant and the whole the way it works. I mean, it's nothing to do with Quavers, but the title screen has got like an animation just before it, and then it's got like it's all driven around ants and their world, and the way the video opens is it's got Colin Curly losing his Quavers, and then it's called Giant or Giant. I mean, Lord Almighty! I mean, what can you say to that? And he jumps into it's an anthill, jumps down after to catch his Quavers, and then just ends up in the levels of the game. That's it. That's the entire story. You've got to work your way through the levels to find his Quavers, and then every so often you end up giving him a pack, and then he loses them again, and that's it throughout the entire game. But I did find that when I was reading an interview by Keith Waterson, and I found this over on the Code Tappers blog site, so it was quite a handy interview actually. But he was saying that the Quavers promotion was completely forced on at a later date. The game was practically finished, and so they just sort of smudged it in round the edges and put that intro in, and that's why the game itself doesn't have like a proper title screen. It's very odd. It's just like the intro comes in, you come to another screen with a load of like scores on, and then you just straight into the levels. The levels themselves, I think there's about 100 of them, so a big chunk across the 2 discs. From what I could find, the design for them, because it's an action puzzler, there's a lot of these are quite complicated puzzles, but it just seems to be that there was about 5 or 6 members dotted throughout the company, and they just come up with random ideas to put into the game. So there was nothing really special. It wasn't one poor guy sat in a tiny room like banging his head underneath the desk trying to come up with all these really complicated puzzles. One of the interesting things I did find out about it, that at the time, most games didn't really use workbench to exit, to come out of them, and that might sound a bit strange, but what you had to do at the time was just like the Control AA to reset the system. But you could actually come out of Pushover, and when you exited, it would go straight back to the workbench. And if you think about that in modern terms, that's really, really simple. You know, you're in the game, you're playing a Steam game, you've installed locally on your machine as well. Just go to exit menu, straight back into Windows or onto your Mac, whatever it is. But at the time, they just didn't do that, which was probably quite odd, you know, having to restart your entire system just to get back into like your Windows style environment. But this did, and quite neatly as well, I believe, and it didn't have any sort of like memory run over or anything. It was a clean exit and a clean break. So I think for 92, that's quite impressive. With it having 100 levels, the game doesn't have a save system as such, but it does have a password system, and it's nothing too complicated. It's basically 4 or 5 letters, 4 or 5 numbers even, and then that just takes you to a certain level, and I think it keeps your score and stuff. Nothing too complicated, but you know, with 100, as you get much further on in the game, it's getting tougher and tougher. It takes longer to do, so it can be quite handy. Now, the way each level works, I'm probably going to struggle to explain this, but there are multiple floors on every single stage, and the idea of each level is you have to push over a single domino, and when this domino falls and hits others, they all eventually fall, hit a final one, and there's always a final domino which must fall last. And when you do that, a big door swings open, and then you can take your ant and run outside, and that's the end of the level. But where the game part of it comes in is it's actually really complicated, because you have to line each of the dominoes up perfectly. It's not just nice and straightforward, you know, pick a couple of simple ones up, stick them in a line, and it all collapses perfectly, because there's different types of dominoes. There's a bouncing kind, one that floats right above your head, hits the ceiling, and then rolls left or right depending on which angle it gets hit, and then it can knock other dominoes over. Exploding ones, which when pushed on the floor just blow up, and then the domino behind falls through the floor. Yeah, that's actually quite clever now I come to think of it. So I think some that float off left and right and create floors, and there's lots and lots. I'm just picking them at random now because I've played so many of them, and after a while you get so used to them. Now, when the game starts off, I think the first 10 levels or so are actually fairly easy. It gives you a good chance just to learn how each of the dominoes work. I'll say the complicated part of it is trying to plan ahead for how you're going to actually do each puzzle, because the idea is it's all timed. It depends on the level. Some are just as little as like 40-50 seconds. I think I did one level which had 29 seconds, which was a bit crazy, and you got to look at it, see and think what you've got to do. You got to move your character around dead quickly, line everything up, go to the way you think it is, and then push, and then just hope it all works out. Now, if it fails, it don't matter. You can just chuck a little ant off the edge of the screen, and then it resets the same level. You go back in, you get another go, but all the dominoes have gone back. Or you can use a token, which you earn every time you go from one level to the next, which resets you back to where just before you push the last last one. So you can have another go if you think either you pushed it the wrong way, or you think, well, I've done most of the puzzle, I'll just try and move them about. But to be honest, as I was playing it, I just found it's nice and easy. If you screw up, most of the time, the levels aren't that huge until you get much later on, but you can tend to remember where you need. So it's always best to save them tokens as much as possible. Now, not all the floors are reachable. The ant can't jump. It's just very simple. It's left and right, up and down on the floors. There's ladders to some floors. Now, some floors, of course, you just can't get to yet. They've got dominoes in, so you have to line up. So like explosions knock things up and down, or rolling left or right. And it seems to be a very basic game, but the devious thing about it is, as you play it on and the puzzles get more and more complicated, you really do have to take your time, look at it, plan it out properly, get a good idea of what you need to do, and often the time limits can be quite strict, but you end up like repeating the level constantly, so you do pick it up eventually, and some of them can be quite tough puzzles. You think, well, you're only moving a domino from left to right or onto a different floor. I mean, it can only go so many ways, but then you've got things like bouncing about big red blocks which just stick there, and if you bounce a domino off, it'll say go left, it'll bounce right, and then it'll either roll back or collapse. Or you've got to plan it properly. It's the only way to get through, and it does get quite tricky later on in the game, even though it's really, really basic. There's no jump ability, but then that would remove, I think, a lot of the puzzles. Now, the backgrounds to this are actually quite colourful. I mean, they're really well designed. You've got like a technical area, industrial, like factories. That's like most of the starting areas. I think China's in there at one point. I think I saw bits of Japan, loads of like katanas, Japanese swords, Meccano style sets. I don't know what else to describe it of. I'm assuming you all know what Meccano is. It's like a million years old now, but you can basically build things with it, and it's covering all sorts of backgrounds. And I think I saw Lego blocks at one point, but that might be my memory. Now, it does have quite strict time limits, as I said, and you've only got one push to make it all work and to get through quickly. And there's occasions where you do the push and everything's lined up, but if you are in a certain place at a certain point, let's just say like one domino falls and then it creates a bridge over to the other side to knock the others over. If you're not on the floor below where the exit is in time, then you get trapped up there and then you fail a level. So a fair few times you've got to dart back and forward, push your dominoes off, and then peg it across the screen down multiple levels and get just in place in time for it all to line up just right. And it's a lot more exciting than it sounds, I can promise you. And luckily you do have the tokens. They do help a great deal, I've found. But for the early part of the game, probably about the first 30 or 40 levels, I don't think I even needed to use a single one. Now, I did find that the game, it requires an awful lot of focus. And what, for me, I think anyway, you have to be in the zone. And at first when you're playing, you just think, oh yeah, I'll just do this puzzle, and it really does draw you in. It's very, very, it's like playing an iPhone game, like one of them sort of games where there's very, very simple things to do, but it's a bit puzzling. You just have to keep your mind at it and you try to work it out. And I mean, I just sat down at one point to play it for about just 10 or 15 minutes just to get through a few levels, see what was coming up. And 40 minutes had passed. And I think straight away that's the sign of a game pushing good. There's something special there if it keeps you coming back. And just thank God for that password system, or as I was using the save state so many times. Now, one of the biggest problems I did find with the game, I mean, considering now the time limits are quite strict and you need to be in certain places at the right time, the controls are awfully clunky. I mean, I tried it with keyboard, I tried it with multiple pads, even tried it with a classic original joystick, and I just didn't have any luck. And the problem with it comes is when you go up to a domino and you're on the left side or the right side, and you have to tap up in order to get in line at the right place. But it doesn't always recognise it, and it can nudge you over slightly. It just seems a bit slow, as if there's a delay. And it's nothing you can't work by. I mean, it's not too bad of an issue, but there are times when you're getting a bit frustrated and you're stuck on a puzzle and you try to work it out, and it just feels like the controls in places are fighting with you, just to get through a section. But look, it's not too bad. It's forgivable, especially for the type of game it is. I mean, it is a puzzle game. It's not too difficult to get around, but it did from time to time just annoy me a little bit. I mean, again, sometimes you need that speed. You've got to just push the dominoes, run left, down a ladder, run right, down a ladder, jump, go running across before something falls through, and then run the other way dead quickly. And some of these levels can be huge. There's loads and loads of dominoes on the screen, and then you've got that problem with the controls, and it just doesn't help. But I don't know what you can do about it. I don't think you can sharpen them up, because I tried it on an emulator and on my original Amiga 1200. It's the same on both. Now, another thing I wanted to mention was the difficulty. I mean, when I was playing through the game and I was thinking about this and what I was going to talk about, and then I suddenly realised that, each person is different. It's like for me, for instance, like members of my family are really, really good at crossword puzzles, and I can't do them for love nor money. And it just depends on the type of person. But I found with this that the puzzles weren't too taxing, and I think on my very first go, I managed to get through about 25 or 30 levels. And I've said that the first 10 levels or so were all like practice tutorial style levels. So the difficulty doesn't really ramp up. And even though I lost a big chunk of time in it, I kept thinking to myself, well, if there's only 2 discs and 100 levels, then I could probably do this in a couple of nights of play. So the difficulty for me just didn't seem to work. But maybe other people are just completely different with this type of game. They might take longer to puzzle it out. And I suppose it's dependent on how you feel about that sort of a game. Now, again, to me, I found it quite addictive. I came back to this over several nights, and I think I only managed to get up to about level 72, 73. And, I had to cover it for the episode, and I'd never got to a point in it where I was completely stumped that, which a bit of time and a few bits of trial and error wouldn't get me through. But the one thing I did enjoy about it is it was just incredibly addictive. And also at the same time, I think that might be a bit disappointing back in the day, because you wouldn't get stuck on a section too much. And if you paid especially £26 and, you've got this latest title and you complete it in just several nights, I know what kids are like, especially back then, they're just flown through it straight away. So a bit disappointing on that front. And I think maybe we could have just done with some more levels. For the time, this didn't do too badly in the magazines. Amiga Action gave it 88%, Amiga Format 86%, Amiga Power 79%. I think that was probably the lowest I could find. The One gave it 83%, Zero Magazine 80%. Pretty average, it's an 80% to really, like I say, highest there was Amiga Action. They weren't really going overboard with it. I mean, most of them were saying it was an above average game. The whole thing with Quavers didn't fit into this game at all. It just seems like Ocean were after another backpack sort of game, something that'd be really popular, have a famous-ish character on the front. I mean, you got to remember back in the day, Quavers were pretty huge. The commercials that they were running with Lenny Henry, again, I think that was Lenny Henry, were quite popular, and they probably thought, well, if we stick our tail on this, we'll probably get some of the hits and it'll be famous and kids will recognise it for Christmas, because it's quite a clever bit of box art that they put on the Commodore Amiga. But I could not find any sales figures for that 600, so I've literally no idea. And I was trawling all sorts of parts of the internet, reading forums going back years, and there was just nothing. I even managed to find some of the old Commodore, the staff at the time, but they'd never really talked about it. So if anybody knows, come and stick it on the website or something. I mean, overall, it's not a bad puzzle game. I had quite a lot of fun with it. I didn't think it was anything special. I could probably, if I could go back to it, probably will do actually. So in that sense, it's good enough. It does the job. It's entertaining. I think most of it, a lot of it reminds me of like modern day, like mobile phone games. I don't even know if it's ever been remade, but it would be ideal for it. It just needed more levels. I mean, I didn't find them too taxing. Again, that it might be difficult for other people, but even then, once you hit that 100, it might seem like a lot, but all the levels are pretty much single screen, so it's not like there's lots of scrolling left and right, and, you know, once you've got through them, you're not really going to have the interest to go back through them all, because once you know the solution, it's so fast and quick a lot of the time that you're not going to want to keep coming back to it and playing it over and over. So I don't think it's got a long bit of a replay value. And it's an odd thing really, but I mean, especially as it was at the time with Amiga games, but to me this felt a bit like a demo. It didn't seem like it had enough to be a full game. And as I was playing it more and more, and I started thinking, no, was it really worth that $25.99? Is this the sort of thing that should have really been stuck on as a big magazine release? Saying, oh, we've got a free game for you. It's just not up there. But at the same time, I was thinking, maybe if they had just, they spent 18 months or so making this, if they just had another 2 months where they could have just sat down with team members and said, let's add an extra 30, 40, 50 levels. Oh, I could never stop. 100 levels, 200 levels. I mean, it was already 2 discs. I couldn't find out how much space was taking up on them discs, but I suspect they could have squeezed a few more puzzles on there, or at least done sort of an expansion pack. Maybe they did. I didn't see any on magazines, because that would have been quite handy, You get to the end of the game or something, you get a special code and you can unlock something as part of it. I don't know. I can actually, I can understand the reviews. None of them pushed it over 90% because I just don't think there's enough there. It just hasn't got enough lastability to get you, to keep you entertained, to keep you coming back, which is a bit of a shame. It just needed that little bit more development time. I would say it's definitely worth going back if you've not played this game before, or this sort of a game, because there's enough in it to entertain you for a while with the puzzles, and it kept me going for at least a couple of nights. You might not, you get about 10 or 20 levels and you'll know whether or not it's good enough for you. But yeah, definitely it's worth going back to. I feel like it just needed a bit more work, but I had a good enough time. What more can I say? Well, guys, I think that's the perfect time to finish the podcast. As always, thanks for listening. By all means, if you have any suggestions or comments, then come over to AMIGArama.com or come and see me on Twitter, which is at AMIGArama Pod. That was a terrible name, wasn't it? I couldn't use, I don't know who else was using AMIGArama, but it was quite annoying. I said I do have a Patreon on the site. If anybody wants to, I'm not, I will always keep the podcast running. I'm having a great time running the podcast, but it's there if you want to it, and that's it's Patreon/AMIGArama. I'll say there are extras on there. One of them is just like every week I do quite a fair bit of notes actually, just to keep myself on track when I'm talking. I've been doing scans of them and sticking them on at a level, but see what you think. Go and have a look at the website most of all, because like I say, I put so much work into that. I think it's doing well. I've been having a fair few visitors, and the podcast is still going week after week after week. So yeah, until next time, guys.